In the Gospel of Mark, we are told the story of Jesus healing a blind man. As Jesus and the disciples came to Jericho, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus hears of Christ's arrival and begins to cry out for mercy. Jesus instructs his followers to bring the man to him. Then he asks Bartimaeus, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man's only request is to see again, which is granted as Jesus tells him, "Your faith has made you well." A very similar story also appears in Luke's Gospel. Approaching Jericho, Jesus and the disciples encounter a blind man shouting for mercy. Jesus orders the man brought to him, asks what he wants, and then restores his sight per the man's request. Yet another similar story can be found in Matthew. Interestingly, Matthew's version takes place as the disciples and Jesus are leaving Jericho, and features two blind men who cry out for mercy. Jesus calls for the men to be brought to him, asks what they want, and then grants their wishes of healing their blindness by touching their eyes. Are these three different versions of the same story, or three different stories? One can easily see there are variations between the stories, but there are many similarities too, and it is arguable that the similarities far outweigh the variations. What are the odds that Jesus and the disciples encountered Bartimaeus, one unnamed blind man, and two other blind men, all on their way near Jericho, who each pleaded for mercy from the Son of David, who shouted more loudly when others tried to quiet them down, who were called for by Jesus and asked what they wanted, who each requested to see again, and who were then healed? Most people would say these are three versions of the same story, despite some obvious differences. In fact, there are many other examples like this one in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John's Gospel, however, features a great deal of content that is not recounted in the other Gospels. Because of their amount of shared material, which is often arranged for comparison in a synopsis, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are commonly referred to as the Synoptic Gospels, meaning seen together. The synoptic problem, then, is the problem of how to explain all the material common to the first three Gospels. But is this even a problem? Some apologists have suggested that the similarities could simply be evidence of an underlying oral tradition relied upon by each Gospel author. Clever as this idea may seem, it fails to account for a number of factors. One of these factors is the use of identical language. In the story of the blind beggar, Mark and Luke both use the same Greek phrase when Jesus asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" and in the response, "That I might receive sight." Though we can expect to find such things in a case of textual interdependence, oral tradition cannot really explain this verbatim language. Another factor is the arrangement of material. While Matthew's author rearranged some of the stories of Mark for his Gospel, Luke pretty much follows Mark's chronology. There is also topical arrangement of content in the Synoptics, like using a miracle story in different places to convey a certain message. It's exceedingly difficult to argue that oral tradition can account for how authors have arranged narratives and sayings in their text. Oral tradition alone cannot explain both chronological and topical agreements when one often implies discrepancy for the other. Perhaps the most persuasive evidence of a literary relationship is the presence of editorial or parenthetical statements in the Gospels. In the middle of Jesus' discussion of the signs of the end times in Mark 13, we find the phrase, "Let the reader understand." Matthew 24:15 reproduces this phrase verbatim. Oral tradition cannot be the explanation for this because of the reference to a reader. In other passages, Jesus is depicted speaking a familiar invitation, "He who has an ear, let him hear," and yet this is not what we find in this instance. These three factors form a powerful argument against an underlying oral tradition accounting for all of the material shared between the synoptics. Of course, this doesn't mean that oral tradition hasn't shaped some of the Gospels, or that it can't explain some of the similarities. However, it should be apparent that a literary relationship among Matthew, Mark, and Luke does exist. Put another way, the synoptic problem is indeed a real problem. Over the centuries, several solutions to this problem have been proposed, typically identifying either Mark or Matthew as the first of the synoptic Gospels. The Augustinian hypothesis, developed by St. Augustine, puts Matthew as the earliest Gospel and claims that Mark used Matthew while Luke used Mark. I think of this as the trickle-down theory, and it also uses the ordering found in the Christian canon. A derivative of the Augustinian hypothesis is the Griesbach hypothesis, set out in the 18th century, which places Luke before Mark and argues that the latter used both Matthew and Luke as sources. The Augustinian and Griesbach hypotheses are the two main theories that favor Matthew as the earliest written Gospel. In the 19th and 20th centuries, another theory called the two-source hypothesis began to accrue support from the scholarly community, thanks to figures like Heinrich Julius Holtzmann and B.H. Streeter. The two-source hypothesis claims Mark is the earliest gospel and one of two sources used by both Matthew and Luke. The second source is a hypothetical document known as Q, which comes from the German word Quell for source. Q is usually associated with material that is shared by Matthew and Luke, yet absent from Mark, and the majority of this material is ascertained to be sayings as opposed to narratives. Due largely to its hypothetical nature, Q is not without its critics. In 1955, the Farrer hypothesis was formulated as a way of dispensing with Q, arguing that Luke actually borrowed content from Matthew as well as Mark. Currently, the two-source hypothesis is the solution favored by the majority of biblical scholars. To appreciate why, let's briefly consider its two central claims. First, what is the case for the priority of Mark? Upon immediate reflection, we will notice that Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, and it lacks a number of elements found in Matthew and/or Luke, such as the infancy narratives, the Sermon on the Mount, and the post-mortem appearances, to name a few. Although omissions are often made when an author uses a source, it is difficult to understand why Mark's author would have omitted these major components of the Christian story. What believer wouldn't be interested in Jesus' birth, the wisdom delivered in the Sermon on the Mount, or the post-mortem appearances? Omissions are always made with reason, and yet the absence of this material from Mark is quite inexplicable. It's much easier to conceive of these stories as additions rather than omissions. Another argument that supports this view is based on the agreement between the synoptics. For example, Mark and Matthew may agree on a passage, meaning that they share a lot of similar wording and structure, while Luke may disagree. Likewise, Mark and Luke may agree against the opinion of Matthew. However, by comparison, there is very little agreement of Matthew and Luke against Mark. What does this mean? It means that Matthew and Luke were not composed independently of Mark, but more than this, it also suggests that Mark is the original source. New Testament scholar Daniel B. Wallace illustrates this perfectly. Of Mark's 11,025 words, only 132 have no parallel in either Matthew or Luke. Percentage-wise, 97% of Mark's Gospel is duplicated in Matthew, and 88% is found in Luke. On the other hand, less than 60% of Matthew is duplicated in Mark, and only 47% of Luke is found in Mark. Under the Augustinian hypothesis, Mark is just a heavily edited copy of Matthew, with a lot of Matthean content omitted for no apparent reason. The Griesbach hypothesis treats Mark as a synthesis of Matthew and Luke, but also doesn't really convincingly account for the large chunk of omitted material. Why is it that there is so much agreement with Mark, while there is so little of Matthew and Luke preserved in Mark? A third argument for Markan priority rests on the primitive nature of the text itself. R. H. Stein, C. M. Tuckett, and other scholars have noted that Mark has the most colloquial language of the Gospels. In a few parallel passages, Matthew and Luke omit Aramaic expressions, smooth out troubling statements, and delete redundancies found in Mark. These alterations and omissions all have fairly plausible explanations, unlike the supposed absence of Matthean and Lucan material from Mark, which is surmised by some of these other hypotheses. As you may see, the case for Markan priority is relatively strong. But what about the other source in the two-source hypothesis? Scholars have observed a number of verses common to Matthew and Luke that are not found in Mark. Two possibilities present themselves for this relationship. Either one gospel used the other, or the two gospels share a third source. Mark Goodacre has recently drawn attention for carrying on the Farrer tradition of dispensing with Q by attributing the Q content to Luke's use of Matthew. Although I have not yet read Goodacre's book, there are a few questions that arise from this contention. Most notably, how does one explain Luke's cherry-picking of sayings passages from Matthew? The large majority of content shared by Matthew and Luke that is not in Mark is made up of sayings of Jesus or John the Baptist. By contrast, a good number of non-sayings passages found in Matthew, or even Matthew and Mark, are missing from Luke, not to mention sayings found in Matthew that are not used by Luke. That sayings collections did exist, and in written form, was settled with the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas. There is also the very different ordering Luke employs for certain stories and passages, as opposed to Matthew's ordering. All of this puts Q opponents at the disadvantage of explaining Luke's seemingly arbitrary method of incorporating the text of Matthew into his own Gospel. Hopefully Goodacre addresses these issues, but whether he really resolves them remains to be seen. Another argument in favor of Q rests on doublets in the Gospels. As an example, Matthew's Gospel twice reports Jesus' hyperbolic instruction on removing an offending appendage, in 5:29-30 and 18:8-9. Interestingly, only one of these versions is paralleled in Mark. Why include the same saying in two different passages? It's hard to imagine that Matthew's author was responsible for one instance of it only a few chapters before copying another instance from Mark. No parallel exists in Luke's Gospel either. This doublet might be explained as Matthew copying the same saying from both Mark and Q, where they may have been used in different contexts. Under some of the other hypotheses, we are asked to believe that either Matthew produced an original document with the doublet already in it, or that Luke copied from both Matthew and Mark, which each feature this saying, yet left this material out altogether for no known reason. In large part, the authority of the two-source hypothesis comes from its explanatory scope and explanatory power. As we've seen, it is capable of accounting for a number of difficulties that the other proposed solutions have a harder time explaining. Nonetheless, like any theory, the two-source hypothesis also has its weaknesses. Obviously, Q is a hypothetical because the document no longer survives, if it existed at all. However, a great number of early Christian texts are now lost to us, and source reconstruction is neither unusual nor is it presumed to be exact, so this weakness seems fairly trivial. More troubling might be the existence of those passages where Matthew and Luke do agree against Mark and appear to have no relation to Q. Yet disagreements with Mark may not mean that Matthew and Luke have a literary relationship of their own. In some cases, the disagreements follow from the logic of the passage, or the common sense of the reader, and so each author could have arrived at their conclusions independently. As previously discussed, there is evidence to suggest that Matthew and Luke corrected Mark's grammar, deleted redundancies, and smoothed over troubling statements. Therefore, it is not unimaginable that these writers would have independently come to some of the same decisions against the more primitive text of Mark. At present, the two-source hypothesis does seem to account for the facts better than the other hypotheses. Of course, all theories are subject to change in the light of new evidence. In the next episode of this series, we will take a closer look at Q, as well as the Gospel of Thomas.